Our next speaker is Alex Moore, and Alex is a member of the board of directors of TMX Inc., and he's an associate professor of environmental health and chair, the director of climate change and public health at Long Island University. Alex, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we'll enjoy what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here today with this fantastic panel. It's the second year for us on Wall Street Green Summit, and really appreciate this event. In addition to being on the board of directors at TMX and the Daniels Family Sustainable Energy Foundation, I'm a climate scientist and public health scientist. And as you all may be aware, given the continuous news cycle about climate news, we are seeing some rather drastic changes in the world. Antarctica and the North Pole reaching temperatures unheard of before. We're seeing also increasing number of days per year for several regions of the world that are becoming uninhabitable. So days above 100 Fahrenheit, which are the danger to health. And of course, the populations that are weathering these, quite literally, these storms and these new climate conditions are the least socioeconomically able in the world. So from tropics all the way to the Middle East and Southeast Asia. One of the things that we expect as a result of the increasing global warming that we are experiencing due to man-made greenhouse gas emissions is also an increase in energy demand, what is called a positive feedback loop, but there's actually nothing positive about it. Whereby people will try to cool their spaces, places where they live, in order to continue living there. And I just want to show a few slides very quickly. This is probably unknown to the general public, but the rest of the world isn't actually air conditioned. If you look at India, Indonesia particularly, and these are the parts of the world that are most populous, that have the most people and are expected to grow fastest. So the energy demand increase in those areas of the world will be enormous. The energy demand according to IEA for India and Southeast Asia will be between 140 and 200%. Africa is also right there with 160%. All of these areas are barely air conditioned. There's barely any air conditioning. So most of that energy will actually go to air conditioning and space cooling, which already takes 37% of our energy demand. And this map here that looks kind of weird is the map of solar irradiance. That is where sun hits the most. There are some areas of the world that have more cloud cover and therefore don't have as much solar irradiance, as much sunlight. But other parts of the world, like for example, sub-Saharan Africa and Australia and India and China and the Middle East have in fact full solar irradiance almost an entire year. So we have some reduction targets that are completely at odds with these trends, and renewable energy is not growing fast enough, particularly in the United States. We are still at 9 to 15%, depending on how you count it. I generally don't count hydroelectric energy as necessarily a green energy because it is rather destructive to ecosystems. If anybody's familiar with Ecological, that's the first giant environmental disaster that was sponsored by the US government in the 20th century. And a lot of the hydroelectric energy is actually being rerouted toward non-essential services, non-essential needs. So in fact, it is not in a zero-sum game. A lot of the renewables and a lot of the hydroelectric are going toward luxury emissions, really, rather than essential emissions. And in the United States, of course, most of the demand comes from the southern states in particular, and those all are using that type of energy for air conditioning. So the problem is we're getting hotter and we don't know how to at least cool our spaces without causing the world to get even hotter, not only by consuming more energy, but also by creating heat island effects by concentrating air conditioning in urban areas, as many of us are familiar if you live in New York City or any other city with dense population and high energy demand. So we need a solution, a bridge technology of some kind to deflect some of this energy back, at least into the atmosphere, so that indoor spaces are cooled. And that bridge technology happens to exist, has been developed over many years, and it has been patented. And it essentially deflects solar energy back into the atmosphere in the same sort of way that sunscreen works, if you want to simplify it to its minimal components. We call it a heat abatement technology, TMX, and it essentially means creating a surface, composite materials that are nano-engineered to deflect the full spectrum of solar energy, not just the visible spectrum, in order to deflect as much energy as possible from living spaces and reduce the need for air conditioning, as you can see here. Just very schematically represented. These materials can be applied to any existing structure, and not only to roofs, but also to external areas. And of course, they can be calibrated to different latitudes, because of course the sun doesn't hit the same way in all places. Current standard materials that generate that really reflect light, like painting your house white, only really deflect part of the spectrum of the light. And in fact, nanomaterials that are actually engineered rather than randomly created can deflect much more, which will add up in more or less about 30%, up to 30% in energy demand reduction. I know it's not a fun topic, energy demand reduction, because we all want economic growth, but in fact, we live on a finite system, and economic growth in the energy space is not necessarily something we want. And certainly not as fast as it's coming, and certainly not from the sources it's coming from. A 30% reduction per year in carbon emissions would essentially amount to, for the United States, for energy from cooling, to 8 million fewer cars on the road. That's the equivalent. Or if you wish, 38 billion pounds of coal not burned, or if you wish, 81 million barrels of oils not consumed. And worldwide, that number is even more impressive. 30% reduction in carbon emissions would account for 129 million fewer cars on the road, or the equivalent of 120 million fewer cars on the road, or 1,500 gas power plants. And you can see these are all from the EPA. No, I didn't create these figures. I just calculated the total and did a 30%. So that is really what I'm here to discuss today, and to really reiterate the urgency of finding a solution and providing solutions that are not just conversion of current energy and the trading of energy. Of course, in fact, I think that quantifying these savings for structures that adopt this type of technology would mean eventually creating credits for buildings and for green buildings. It's one of the easiest ways to implement green building technologies in existing structures, particularly structures that don't have the capital to convert into efficient buildings in particularly socioeconomically developing areas of the world. Not everyone is Norway or Sweden or Finland or other countries in the world that have achieved high energy efficiency standards for their buildings. Those changes have come at a cost that many countries just cannot afford, particularly given the structures that most of their population live in. So this type of technology should be understood as a bridge technology to give the time to energy conversions of existing oil and gas and fossil fuel infrastructure to be essentially replaced by renewables. As it is happening, it is not happening fast enough. And from the research side of these things, from the expert side of the climate scientists, it seems to be to us, that we are in a conversation that is really one-sided, and we're screaming into a bottle, and nobody's really listening. And of course, the economy, the global economy, is a very complex system. There are many interests at play here, so it couldn't be as easy as switching the light off, or switching off power plants. And so the need for bridge technologies really is the one thing that can give us a breath of fresh air, and kind of let us catch our breath as we reach those, or try to reach those goals of energy and emissions reduction. As a scientist, I support this type of solution because I honestly am not seeing any other viable ones. Not growing fast enough. So I'm the only ones that I wish were more viable and more widespread, such as rewilding and land conservation, or even carbon recapture, are not scalable at the speed that we need to reach in order to avert the worst of climate change. So that's 15 minutes. I'm happy to take 5 minutes of questions if that works. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alex. That was a great intro for it. So to the audience, if you have any questions for Alex, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we can. Alex, we've got a couple coming in already here. One is just a question to clarify: are there any additive activities within your model? Are you looking at geothermal, for example, at all for cooling and heating?
Sure. We have patents. So I should have mentioned all of our technologies are patented. We have patents that actually cover the entire building and include energy sourcing and energy management of the entire building. However, geothermal, even though it is rather cheap once installed, it is not a technology that's easily implementable, easily adapted to the most populous and fastest growing populations in the world. So if you want to try and scale geothermal in Indonesia or the Philippines or India, be my guest. That is a very large project with enormous competition, by the way, from traditional energy sources. This particular market, interestingly, is not red ocean. It's mostly a blue ocean. There isn't a whole lot of competition, and we're talking to all the other people who are in it. And so it as I said, it can be plugged in both in developed and developing economies. And our greatest priority is the developing economies, because that's where the demand is coming from.
Great. Yeah, and on that note, someone's asking, are these building materials currently available widely, or are they emerging, or are they
not widely available yet? We are about to create We are about to create a distribution agreement. So that's currently under development, so I can't really disclose the details, but they will be available very soon.
Okay. Someone's asking here, with the alarming rates of heat increase in places like India, for example, they're interested in your view of the odds that global geoengineering efforts may gather some traction. Some volcanologists have suggested that injecting sulfur dioxide into the upper stratosphere would have a sun screening effect. It would seem that adding heat abatement technologies is a much preferred technology with better known outcomes. Do you agree? Are you following debates around geoforming engineers?
So I love these questions because they give me a chance to rant. And injecting sulfuric acid into the atmosphere, which would have to be done continuously by planes, and a colleague of mine from Harvard actually has a company to do that. Will cause enormous damage to the world's ecosystem, particularly because sulfuric acid doesn't stay in the atmosphere. It rains eventually. You know what that's called? Acid rain. We know what that is, and what the effects of that are. And the ocean is already acidifying fast enough as it is, with CO2 penetrating into it and destroying coral reefs. And animals that live in a very specific pH. So no, those geoengineering is not the way to go. We have created this problem by thinking that we are the masters of nature and that we can solve any problem by simplifying it in our little minds. The reality is, as was shown by one of the first talks, that the environmental system is the Earth's ecosystem is an incredibly complex system that cannot be understood simply by a human mind, or let alone even a computer, although we're trying with some of my colleagues at Oak Ridge National Lab. So no, we can't try to patch our way out of a Titanic. We have to, find another solution. The only really geoengineering technology that I sort of like is carbon recapture, direct carbon recapture from the atmosphere. However, so far, and I'm happy to be found wrong, and I'll buy a drink to whoever proves me wrong. So far, my understanding is that it cannot be scaled fast enough to actually have significant changes to the atmosphere and the trends that we are seeing. But I'm all for scaling that up and capturing and fixing it, especially in building materials, so that it doesn't go back into the carbon cycle.
Why don't we end on this one from Martin Bernstein? In some areas, one might want to absorb solar engineer in the winter and reflect in the summer. Is that possible? And is there a cost efficiency point for rooftop solar when it becomes more efficient than reflecting incoming solar radiation?
It's possible, and we have also technology to do that. All the patents are actually on our website, which I think I put in the chat. Here we go. Yes, it's possible. As I said earlier, these nanomaterials can be applied to existing structures and can be calibrated by latitude. They can also be deployed with complementary patented structures that can in fact address the problem that you just indicated.
Great. Well, that's a good note to wrap up on then. Thank you, Alex. That was awesome. If there are other questions that people have, either that haven't been answered or that you would like to ask on the back of this, feel free to reach out to Alex and we can take this offline. But thank you, Alex. Appreciate the observations.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, David.